I'd like to welcome you to this evening's online seminar. This is our second in a series. We've got another two to come, and you will have seen the adverts for them scrolling through. So tonight, my name is Jim McQuaid, and I'm at the Institute for Climate and Atmospheric Science at the University of Leeds. And I'm going to introduce our speaker tonight, who I've actually been working with for some 15 years now, although you wouldn't know it by looking at her. So Dr. Claire Ryder did an undergraduate at the University of Reading in meteorology, and then following that she stayed at the University of Reading to do her PhD from 2005 to 2009. And the subject of that was aircraft observations of Saharan dust. And it was in 2006 when I met her on a field project in Senegal, working with our research aircraft. And then after that, she spent 2 years at Imperial College in London, looking at urban aerosols, so something different from mineral dust. Following this, she returned to the University of Reading, went back to looking at mineral dust out of West Africa and the Saharan region. And that was involved in a large project called FENIC, which was looking at the influence of the Sahara on the local climate and local and regional climate system. And then following this, she stayed working with aircraft and worked on a project called Samba at the University of Reading. And this was looking at Brazilian biomass burning. Aerosol, again, this is using the research aircraft. And then from 2015, she's been based at Reading, and she's a NERC independent research fellow, and she's looking at the role of coarse mineral dust in the climate system. So I think I've covered everything there, Claire. So I'm really looking forward to this talk, because it was my idea to get you in to do this. I'll hand over to you.
Thanks very much for the introduction, Jim. Can you hear me okay? I'll assume that's a yes.
Just some instructions for our viewers. You can see in the top bar there are two arrows that are moving apart from each other. That will enlarge your screen. You'll be able to see the video of myself and Claire, and there's a line underneath that, and you can drag that vertically to maximize the size of the slides. We've got a chat window beside. And if you want to pose any questions for Claire, if you want to put them into the chat during the talk, and we'll come back to those and go through those at the end of the talk. And if you want to minimize that chat window, there's an arrow that's pointing at a vertical line, and that will allow you to move the chat away so you can again see the maximum content of the slides. Sorry, Claire, the floor is yours.
Okay. Thanks very much, Jim, for the introduction. So I'm Claire Ryder from the University of Reading. I'm an independent research fellow there. And I'm going to be talking to you today about the, as it came to be known, the Godzilla Saharan Dust Plume of June 2020 this year. So thank you for inviting me to give this talk. It's a real pleasure to be here. And before I start, I should also mention that some acknowledgements go to many other aerosol and dust scientists on Twitter who've given inspiration and input towards some parts of this talk. Okay, so what was it that happened in June 2020? Well, there was a massive dust storm which travelled all the way from the Sahara, several thousand kilometres across the Atlantic Ocean towards the Americas. And you can see here a smattering of screen grabs from various news outlets at the time. It was particularly picked up on the American side of the dust outbreak. So we can see an indication of that here. So we've got massive Saharan dust clouds shrouding the Caribbean, historic Saharan dust plume darkening the skies, dangerous air pollution in the US coming from the dust, and record plume of Saharan dust reducing visibility in Puerto Rico. And you can see the capital and the skyrise buildings in the haze there. So I'm going to talk you through this event and why it happened and what it was. So the outline of my talk is that, first of all, I'll give a big brief background into mineral dust, describing what it is for those people not in the aerosol world. Then most of the talk is going to be focusing on the June 2020 event, the Godzilla storm. And then briefly at the end, I'll give you a quick taste of some of my current research into Saharan dust. So what is dust? On the left here, you can see a depiction of different aerosol particle sizes. So dust aerosols come at the larger end of this. So aerosols in general can go from nanometers to several hundred microns. Dust tends to be at the larger end of this size spectrum. It's mechanically generated as opposed to chemically generated, in contrast to other aerosol types. So lost it there. So mechanically generated aerosol includes dust, windblown dust, which is what I'll be talking about, but also sea spray, sea salt aerosols, and volcanic aerosol. And just to give you visually an idea of what kind of thing we're talking about here, at the bottom you can see an enlarged image of a human hair, which is about 50 microns in diameter. And then you can see the red and the blue dots, which show the size of PM2.5. This is aerosol smaller than 2.5 microns diameter, and then in blue, aerosol smaller than 10 microns diameter. And dust particles can frequently be this small. They can also be much larger, and they can be up to the sizes of those grains of sand there, so up to about 100 microns, or sometimes even more. We call it the giant dust. So that gives you an idea of the sizes we're looking at. What's dust made of? Well, typically it reflects the parent soil it's been taken from, and whatever that was made of. So generally we see that most dust particles are composed of quartz. Of course, there's variation region to region, and in time, and with transport, and also with size. But by and large, a lot of them are made up of quartz, with about 20% coming from clays such as illite and kaolinite. You can also get a smattering of other different minerals such as calcite, gypsum, and iron oxides, which can be particularly important. For example, hematite is very absorbing to sunlight, so that's one we tend to be interested in. And you can see some images there which come from filter samples collected on aircraft campaigns that I've been involved with over the years. You can get quite interesting shapes appearing. So dust in the climate system. Dust has numerous effects on the climate system. I'll start with, on the top left, its radiative effects. So dust affects atmospheric radiation in two ways. Firstly, it reflects sunlight back out to the atmosphere by scattering it back upwards, and that reduces the amount of sunlight or shortwave radiation reaching the surface. And then secondly, because dust also is composed of large particles as well as small, this means it's able to absorb and re-emit long-wave radiation or heat emitted from the surface of the Earth, and this can cause a warming effect. So these two effects tend to act in opposite directions to each other, depending on all sorts of complex factors and situations. So this allows dust to either warm or cool the planet, and also heat or cool the atmosphere. So moving on, if dust is able to alter the radiation balance and heat the atmosphere, in very dusty parts of the world, such as West Africa, this allows it to change circulation patterns, which can then go on to affect regional circulations, such as West African precipitation and the monsoon, which you can see there, that's precipitation. So in the Sahel, millions of people are depending on this precipitation. Other ways that dust impacts our climate: it can interact with tropical cyclone development. It can reduce the amount of sunlight reaching the sea surface, and a warm surface, sea surface, is necessary for tropical cyclones to develop, so that can reduce their intensity or development potential. It can also increase wind shear, which acts to stop cyclones developing, and it can also potentially act as a cloud condensation nuclei or an ice nuclei, which can affect how clouds develop, and that's indicated on the top right there. So another thing about dust is that it contains nutrients such as phosphorus and iron, and this can be important to both oceans and the Amazon rainforest when it's deposited. potentially causing climate feedbacks. Dust goes on to affect human well-being as well, probably the most important of which is air quality. It causes air pollution, severely degrades the air quality, causing respiratory problems and cardiac problems. It can affect aviation, but also road transport and rail transport. And then finally, it can negatively affect solar energy generation firstly by reducing the amount of sunlight reaching solar panels, and then secondly, by allowing dusty air to land on the solar panels, which then means they require more cleaning. So there's quite a host of ways that dust interacts with our Earth system. So how does dust get into the atmosphere? We've got a nice illustration on the top right here. So strong surface winds over dry, erodible surfaces initially will cause large sand particles or even pebbles to creep along the surface. As these move along in strong wind conditions, they'll start to saltate, which can then lead to even smaller particles being emitted into the atmosphere, caught up in a horizontal wind flux. And then if we've got strong vertical wind speeds as well, then that can lift some of that horizontal flux up into the atmosphere. So essentially, we need dry, bare, erodible surfaces. We need strong surface winds as well as strong vertical winds. And in models which attempt to replicate reality, obviously, dust uplift is proportional to the wind speed cubed. So dust emissions are really sensitive to those very strong, large wind speeds. On the bottom right, you can see a nice summary and a review by Paola Formenti from 2011. And you can see the different coloured lines there represent various studies, estimates of the most important source regions for dust over North Africa. And the grey regions represent the consensus. So quite a few different source regions over the Sahara. Okay, so once the dust gets up into the atmosphere, where does it get to? So we'll start on the top left. This shows the global mean annual aerosol optical depth, so the atmospheric aerosol loading effectively. And this is all aerosol types, not just dust. However, you can strongly see the impact of dust within this. So for example, you can see high values over North Africa, and you can see a plume extending from West Africa over the Atlantic. There's a lot of seasonal variation in dust emission and transport. And you can start to break some of this down by the plots shown on the right-hand side, which are now dust-only aerosol optical depth. So no other aerosols, just dust. This is a long-term average, and it's separated by season. So you can see that the peak season for the Sahara is June, July, and August in the bottom left. We've got a similar depiction of this on the bottom left. Again, this is dust only aerosol optical depth, but now we've also got data over the ocean, also summertime. And here you can clearly see the Saharan dust plume extending over the Atlantic. And you can also see the other dusty parts of the world, for example, the Middle East, and going slightly into Central Asia. On the bottom right, this image shows the dominant pathways of dust transport across the world. So you can clearly see how North African dust is predominantly transported westwards across the Atlantic. Okay, moving on. The uplift of Saharan dust has been studied quite a lot lately and has quite a few intricacies that are particular to its geographical location and its extreme climate. On the left, you can see a plot by John Marsham, which came out of the Fenwick project, which I was involved with. And this shows dust emission as a function of time of day. So time of day goes along the x-axis. And if you look at the top bar, it gives you the percentage of dust uplift from observations at a Saharan site during June. So, I've lost my screen, there we go. A small fraction of the dust uplift comes from morning, from low-level jets, wind speeds and emissions. An even smaller fraction during the afternoon, about 15% of dust emitted during the afternoon. But by and large, the dominant fraction of dust comes from uplift during the night. And this is caused by moist convective activity, which
Lost Claire for a moment there. I'm sure she's trying to get her connection back to us. Just while we're waiting for Claire, because I was involved in the Fennec project. So we study the Sahara because it's a very important region of the Northern Hemisphere, because we've discovered the amount of energy that goes into the Sahara. Solar radiation has a huge effect, not just locally, but drives these enormous storms, which Claire is currently describing. And one of the incredible things is the boundary layer is very, very low overnight, because as most people know, with no clouds in the desert, it becomes very, very cold overnight. So it can get close to freezing. But as the sun warms the surface, the boundary layer itself, as you can see on John, I'm just finishing off the boundary layer height. The boundary layer
Thanks,
will grow to up to 5 kilometers. So that's a huge effect, and all this energy in the atmosphere can move this dust around. So I think we back Claire, so I've sort of filled in as an amateur.
Apologies for that, I just lost internet connection. So I will attempt to carry on. Sorry about that. Yes, so dust can get mixed up to about 5 or 6 kilometers over the Sahara. And at this point, it can get transported out westwards in what's known as the Saharan Air Layer. And this is transported out above the marine boundary layer. So at this point, it becomes an elevated layer and can be transported over long distances. And this is the form it goes out towards the Americas in. Okay, going on. So now we'll go on to talking about the June 2020 event. So the main data set I'm going to use to talk you through what happened comes from the OMPS, or Ozone Mapping and Profiling Suite Aerosol Index, which is on board the Suomi NPP satellite. So you can see an example of an image here. It's got a 50-kilometer footprint, and aerosol indexes, which are what you see, are derived from radiances in the UV spectrum, and therefore any values which are positive show the presence of aerosols which are able to absorb in the UV spectrum. So this includes smoke and dust. So you will notice some contribution from smoke popping up. For example, that blob over southern Africa will come from smoke aerosol. But the large plume you can see over North Africa comes from dust. And the nice thing about this parameter is that aerosol index is available in the presence of cloud, unlike aerosol optical depth, which is often very gappy on short timescales. So it's nicer to look at to get a full picture of what's going on day to day. So what I'm going to do now is flick through each of these images. There'll be one image per day, and they're going to show how the dust is transported. So we're going back to the start of June, or nearly just here. This is the 6th. And this isn't when the dust was uplifted, but this is really when it began to collect at the west coast of Africa, ready for transport. So here's the 7th of June. The dust is being transported slightly to the west, although you can see there's a little bit of recirculation, and it's not really moving out across the Atlantic very fast at this stage. It's kind of a little bit stagnated, and really it's actually accumulating over the eastern tropical Atlantic. And this is actually quite unusual for dust. Usually, once it's transported away from the West African coast, it's swept off fairly smoothly out over the Atlantic. And I'll come back to this later in the talk. So over the next few days, really, you see more emissions coming from Africa. A few little bits get transported westwards towards Brazil and the Caribbean, but really most of it is still over West Africa. Now it's really starting to build because it's not being transported westwards very much. It's still recirculating and stagnating. it's starting to look really, really heavy and intense by the 17th of June. And this is pretty much the last day where it's recirculating. As we go on now, you'll see it really begins to move westwards. So 18th of June, 19th, 20th. So we've got quite a big blob. And I think this was roughly about when it began to be called the Godzilla plume, mostly by people on Twitter. So now it's starting to approach the north coast of Brazil and South America. And it's beginning to move over the Caribbean and towards Puerto Rico. You can actually see there's a second pulse over the west coast of Africa now, starting to follow behind it. And if I go on, we're now on the 23rd. So the 22nd, 23rd, and 21st was when the Caribbean islands were really badly affected. You can see it's now moving across the Yucatan Peninsula into the Gulf of Mexico. And by the 24th on this slide, you can see it's kind of reached the coast of the southern states of the US and is partly over Florida. You can see that strong second plume coming out behind it now, almost reaching Brazil. By the 25th of June, this is quite interesting now because you can see parts of the plume which were over the southern states of the US and Florida have now moved out to off the east coast of the US and begin to move northwards. And this is really quite unusual for dust to be transported to remain in the atmosphere this long, that it gets caught up by the westerlies in the mid-latitudes. We rarely see this with Saharan dust. And also, if you watch the Mexico and Central America, you'll see in the next slide, if I go on, that the dust has actually also made it into the Pacific. And again, this is really rare. Generally, Central America is thought to be a pretty effective barrier for Saharan dust. You can also see that dust is still affecting Mexico, Texas, and the states around Florida. And the second pulse is now over the Caribbean islands. Going on, you can see that second pulse coming through now. Not quite as strong as the first one by the time it reaches the Americas, but still fairly strong. And then we're on to the 30th of June now. So this is my last image. More pulses do continue to come from Africa after this, but nothing quite on the scale of the previous two pulses. So this is another way to look at the plume and the intense aerosol loadings that came with it. So what you can see here is maximum aerosol optical depths from the mode.
Possibly have lost the connection to Reading. Again, I'm going to assume that Claire's trying to get back in. Just to let people know, you can put your questions in the chat at the side, and we'll be putting those to Claire when at the end of the talk. And just let people know that this will be the whole talk will be edited down and posted on YouTube. So you can watch it at a later date. We've already had one talk in this series, which was from Professor James Lee, who was talking about the impact of the COVID lockdown on air quality. And then we've got a couple more coming in the next couple of months, looking at the exceptional winter of 2019-20, which I'm sure people can remember back to. And that's Nick Silkstone from the Met Office on the 26th of August. And then Edward Hanna from the University of Lincoln is going to be talking about the North Atlantic Oscillation in the climate system. And that's on the 23rd of September. So as you can see, as Claire was saying, this was quite a significant event, said to be the biggest event for over 50 years. There have been a lot of people watching these events for many years now, and we have as satellites are getting better and better at looking down, and particularly looking down through clouds, we're getting the images that Claire's talking about. So we have our connection to Reading back.
Thank you, Jim. Apologies again. My internet signal seems to be dropping out. Okay, going on. So these images are courtesy of Ryan Maue, and they come from mirror reanalyses of data aerosol optical depth from June. And what they're showing is data across this map region that you can see. It's the same for each of these subplots. And the colours indicate the aerosol optical depth, or the thickness of the aerosol in the atmosphere. And then going down the y-axis, we go from the start of June through to the end of June. And what it allows you to see is aerosol, or mostly dust in this case, propagating with time across the Atlantic towards the Americas. So, for example, 2019 wasn't a particularly dusty June. 2018 looked quite a lot more dusty. You can see the bright colours and the oranges coming through there. And 2016, 2017 kind of middling down at the bottom. If we now compare this to 2020, going on, you can really see the total contrast. This data only goes up to the 22nd of June when it was made. But you can really see, firstly, how much further the dust is propagating across the Atlantic compared to previous years, and also how much heavier the dust loadings were compared to the previous few years. This image comes from Kunal Bali, and what he's showing, again from the MODIS satellite, showing AODs, is the aerosol optical depth anomaly spatially as a function of year. So you can see in the previous 5 years, some were slightly more dusty, some were less, and then you can see those really high red values during 2020. And you can see particularly high values close to the west coast of Africa, where the dust kind of recirculated and stagnated before it was picked up properly by the easterlies. Another way of looking at it is to take data from this slightly orangey box shown here in this map. So this is known as the main development region for hurricanes, which is where people often look at sea surface temperatures as an indication of hurricane development. And what you can see here is for each year, the maximum value across this box from a single day is plotted, going back to 2003. So you can see generally the values are about 1.1 down to 0.6, with some amount of variability. And you can really see how much June the 20th from 2020 sticks out. It breaks all the records without a doubt. And it's the highest value ever recorded over such a wide area within the Saharan dust plume by MODIS. This plot shows reanalysis model data from the ECMWF CAMS model over the whole of June. And again, you can see how high the AODs were and how that extended across the whole Atlantic. So mostly I've talked about satellite data so far. Ground data also tells us the same story. So here you can see an Aerosol Observatory in Puerto Rico. And Olga Mail, who's involved with these observations, said that preliminary PM10 mass concentrations were 350 to 380 micrograms per cubic meter on the 22nd of June, which is the highest value ever seen in 60 years of records. So it's a historic event, really proving how large this dust event was. And perhaps unsurprisingly, the air quality index was very unhealthy. A little bit of work has been done that I've seen about dust forecasts. Lots of forecasting centres were actively forecasting for the event and providing advisory services to local agencies. This is a dust forecast again from ECMWF CAMS model, and it's which is a spaceborne LiDAR. So on the left-hand side, you can see a visual image of 1 day of dust transport, and the yellow lines show the tracks of the satellite. They correspond to the top and the bottom two panels. On the top of each pair, you can see slightly noisy data, which comes from the satellite. And this shows the vertical cross-section of the dust plume. There is quite a bit of missing data, unfortunately, which is where the white patches are. And then in each pair on the bottom, you can see what the model was forecasting. So actually, the model appears to be capturing the vertical structure fairly well in these comparisons, which is a good thing. In terms of the magnitude of the event, on the top left, you can see ground-based measurements of aerosol optical depth from our AeroNet system, our AeroNet network. This is from Cape Verde, off the west coast of Africa. And then on the right, this data comes from Mark Parrington at ECMWF, who's compared their CAMS model, which are the solid lines, to the observations, which are the blue dots. And then we've got the same thing down on the left, but for a Tenerife site. So you can see that the CAMS model forecast does capture the timing of the dust outbreak very well, but it doesn't quite seem to get the magnitude large enough, especially at Cape Verde. It's quite a lot lower. And I'm absolutely
we've lost our connection there. Is Claire still there? It was interesting what she said about while we're waiting for her reconnection. Quite often when we use models, they're quite good at seeing the structure, but quite often they're not particularly good at capturing the magnitudes. That's what we're seeing here in this CAMS, which is a model run by ECMWF, so that's the European Centre for Medium Range Weather Forecasting, and that's in Reading, compared to AeroNet AOD. And AeroNet is a NASA network of instruments on the ground, so their measurements, and you can see that the AeroNet is getting much higher concentrations of the aerosol. But if you sort of look at the structure, so the ups and downs are about the same. It's just the size of the ups and downs that they're not quite capturing. And this is quite a common thing when we're comparing models, between models and measurements or observations, that they get the structure, but they don't quite get the big features. So that's still one of the big challenges that we've got. So we're just going to pick up while we're waiting for Claire. So Tony Flannery, who has put some comments about actually working in the Sahara, and saying that when he was working there, it didn't get quite so cold at night. And the feature that we normally see is that the lack of clouds mean there isn't this insulating blanket to stop the heat from just basically escaping from the surface. So if you go to, when we've been on field work in places like Morocco, if you actually go out into the desert at night, the local Tuaregs and the local tribes will actually sit around fires, and you won't catch them sitting around fires in the middle of the day, but it does get very cold in the evening. So, but the key thing to whether it's going to be a cold night, and even in the UK at the moment, one of the key things, if it's a clear night, it can get quite cold. So you see in a high pressure system where you get lack of clouds and a very clear sky during the summer, you might get a ground frost sort of in the spring, which is to be avoided, certainly if you're a gardener. So I'm just going through some of the questions while we're waiting for. Oh no, here comes Claire.
Hello, so sorry about this.
So I was just saying about the comparison between models and observations, where they capture the structure but not the magnitude.
Thank you, Jim.
Back to you.
Okay. Sorry, I appear to be having real internet problems. Okay, so this was the visibility going on.
Video feed. If you turn your video feed off your camera, that might be better.
Okay, we'll try that. So here we have a variety of air quality advisories during the time period. On the top left, you can see different advisories for the southern US and how that changed. So a significant amount of them were unhealthy, which is actually quite unusual, really, to have that much of a high level of advice. On the right, you can see various advisory Caribbean islands. Some of those are unhealthy too. And then on the bottom left, we've got a statement from a Puerto Rico weather forecaster saying that in 20 years at Puerto Rico, it's the highest air quality index, reaching the hazardous level. So if I was there, I'd definitely be wearing a mask. And perhaps one of the more pleasant aspects of dust storms is that they do tend to produce nice sunsets, and this is due to the extra scattering of red light in a forwards direction by the aerosol particles and dust in the atmosphere. One of the, I think, quite interesting aspects of this dust event is that preceding the dust outbreak during June, sea surface temperatures in the Atlantic in the main development region were actually about 0.6 degrees C above average, which was already ranking as the 4th highest on record for the region for that time period. So there was some concern about the hurricane season. However, you can see that as the dust plume continued throughout June, there was a strong cooling of about 0.4 degrees due to the dust event. So this is a major reduction in the heat, which can drive hurricane developments, and was viewed as quite good news in some corners. However, it's also important to note that dust can get in the way of retrieving sea surface temperatures. So sometimes sea surface retrievals in the presence of dust need to be viewed with caution. So what were the drivers of these unusual conditions? What we've got here are images from the Severi instrument on the Meteosat satellite. This is red, green, blue dust imagery, or also sometimes known as the pinkness product. So here, high clouds appear as red, mid-level clouds appear as orange, and the bright pink colours and sometimes slightly more dull pink colours are the dust. So if you look at the top left image on the 4th of June from 23Z, sort of towards the right hand side of the image, you can see 2 deep red convective cells. And if you look just to the north of that, you can see a kind of dusky pink color outflowing from this. And this is a haboob coming out from convectively driven downdraft associated with that cell. And what we see during early June is near continual dust emission from convective cells through haboobs almost every single night during early June. On the 5th of June, on the top right, you can see more bright pink dust connected to various different cells. And also, if you look sort of further towards the northwest, over Morocco and down into Western Sahara, you can see, again, some red convective cloud. But just to the south of this, kind of lying parallel to it, this is another orographically driven dust event moving towards the more southerly dust. So there were 2 dust storms actually moving towards each other on this case. And then the bottom 2 images, you can see more cases of the dust gradually accumulating across Africa, and then more cases being uplifted as more convective cells develop across West Africa. So one question you might ask is, was the convective activity unusual, or was the soil particularly dry or in a state where it was readily upliftable and erodable? So let's look at the soil dryness. So often this is indicated by the previous season's precipitation. So on the left here, what you can see is the 29 summer precipitation as a percentage of average. And generally, you can see the green and blue colours, which indicates precipitation was fairly normal or even slightly higher. So the soil shouldn't be particularly drier than most years across the Sahara. So that seems to be unlikely. Secondly, let's look at the convective activity during June 2020. On the top right, you can see the precipitation anomaly from May and June across the Sahel. And you can really see from this that there was a lot of precipitation in Africa, West Africa, during this time period. So this seems to be consistent with the fact that we had increased convective activity, which caused the dust uplift. One other interesting aspect to look at, if you remember, I was mentioning how the dust kind of accumulated for quite a few days before it was finally transported out westwards. And you can see here the anomaly in 700 millibar winds, which is the kind of driving altitude for dust plumes over the Atlantic. And you can see here that it's anomalously weak, which I think partly explains why the dust didn't really get transported out very far during early June. It kind of accumulated, and then when the jet finally picked up, there was a lot of dust there waiting, ready to go, and bam. So in the interest of time, I'm just going to move on. This is just really a snippet to say what I work on. I'm particularly interested in the size of dust particles. You can see a schematic on the left here from Mayerweld et al. 2014, which shows you how different components of dust size are important for different parts of dust interaction with climate. There's been a lot of recent work to show that climate models don't include enough coarse dust in them, and that this has quite serious consequences for radiative impacts of dust, and may allow dust to cause a warming effect on the climate rather than a cooling effect as climate models currently report. So I've been involved in a lot of aircraft in situ field work, particularly where we've measured coarse dust particles through a variety of methods, which have shown the prevalence and the importance of coarse dust particles. And some of my results are here, which essentially show that the coarse and the giant dust particles are important to shortwave and longwave radiation. We've shown that dust remains in the atmosphere. Large particles do remain in the atmosphere for longer than we would expect, for several days. And finally, recent work showing that dust models have too many fine particles and too few coarse particles, and also appear to represent dust too low in the atmosphere as they transport it out across the Atlantic from the Sahara. So I've skipped over that quite briefly in the interest of time. I thought it was about time to show a picture of Godzilla, since I haven't done so far. Thank you very much for your attention. Again, apologies for the loss of connection occasionally, and I'm very happy to answer any questions.
Very much, Claire. I think we managed to cover it, and I even demonstrated some of my knowledge.
Yeah, thanks very much for stepping in, Jim. Couldn't have been better.
So I'm just going to go. We've got some really great questions. So I'm going to start off with a question from George, and he asks, was the distribution of the particle size different this year in June 2020 compared to previous years?
The size distribution?
Yes.
I don't think we particularly know a lot about the size distribution from this year. So one of the best ways to find the size distribution and how it changes in the vertical is to send some sort of a sensor, for example, an aircraft, up through the layer to take measurements. And to my knowledge, nobody's been doing that, particularly because of the COVID situation. There was actually supposed to be a major field campaign in the Cape Verde Islands this June, and ironically, they would have had amazing measurements, but that couldn't take place. There's a few ground-based sites which will provide retrievals of the size distribution. I haven't looked at them, so I can't comment on that yet.
Yeah, so I would think it might be a little bit early, because people, they want to be sure of the measurements before because this was such a big event, they want to be sure that they've got validated measurements. But it is very unfortunate, because research aircraft are very good for this sort of giving us these answers.
Yeah.
So thank you for that, George. So then we go to Grant Big from Sheffield. And he says, I recall a dust event in February, which stopped some flights to the Canaries for a couple of days. He's asking, has it been a particularly dustier year overall so far?
Yes, I remember that event actually, because it coincided with partly with the beginning of lockdown in the Canaries and some very disgruntled holidaymakers. Has it been a dusty year overall so far? I have to say I haven't looked at the year overall. However, at least for Africa, for North Africa, it tends to be dominated by the summer season dust, particularly by dust in June. And given that June has been so dusty, I would expect the seasonal average and perhaps annual average too for Africa to be dustier than average. So that's a kind of partial answer for you.
Yes, I guess the February event was the Klima, which is a well-known phenomena coming out of the Sahara. So that does happen quite often. They're used to that. It makes some very warm temperatures at that time of year.
Yeah. So during winter time, the dust tends to be much lower in the atmosphere, up to 1 or 2 kilometers, and because of that tends not to travel quite so far, whereas in the summer the intense convection over the Sahara lifts up to these high altitudes of 5 or 6 kilometers, and because it's then so high, that enables it to be transported over much larger distances. So that's why the summer season is so much more important over the Sahara.
Okay, thank you. So then we've got a question from Matt. And do you know if anyone is analysing the event in relation to aerobiology, viable fungi, bacteria, as Joe Prospero described in 2005? Are we still Claire? Have we lost Claire? Well, I'm guessing Claire's trying to battle her way back onto the internet. So Matt, I guess that one again, because there's not been, it's quite a recent event, and a lot of this sort of analysis does take some time. So I have no doubt that people will have been collecting the surface samples at places like there are sample stations at Cape Verde. There's also sampling done on the in Africa itself, and there's a number of stations in the Caribbean. There's Jagged Point, I think it's called, in Barbados, where Joe Prospero runs samples out. There's Olga Mayles sampling stations in Puerto Rico as well. So I have no doubt that people will have managed to collect some samples, and then this sort of analysis will be continuing after. So is Claire back?
Yeah, I'm back. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Sorry
there was a question from Matt just asking if you know if anybody's been analysing the event in relation to aerobiology. I said there'll be some surface samples from Cape Verde and Ragged Point in Barbados. That's what it's called, and no doubt they'll be looking at that as well.
Yeah, I'm sure this is an excellent case to be looking at that kind of thing, given the high dust loadings. I don't specifically know, so it wouldn't surprise me though if this is an ideal case for people to be looking at.
It does take some time for them to do that, and obviously a lot of facilities are only really just starting back up to do this sort of analysis. And then we've got another question from Grant, which says, did the dust event lead to big increases in primary production in the normally eutrophic subtropical Atlantic? That's
a very good question. I don't know the answer to that. I haven't seen anything on it, but you would expect that kind of thing. So yeah, I don't know. Sorry.
Yeah, quite often we'll see the big phytoplankton blooms associated with these sorts of events. One problem is that if there's dust over the top, you can't see through the dust to see the phytoplankton bloom. It's a sort of chicken and egg that people have to battle with, the geobiologists. Then I've got a question from Mike Webley, and how much real-time PM10 and PM2.5 data and locations have been obtained?
Okay, so I haven't specifically collected any for this event. However, you'll find the World Health Organization sites, which are spattered across the world, will be, including those under the path of the dust, will be measuring both those parameters. And then any of the sort of long-term aerosol-specific observatories will have been measuring these parameters, as well as a host of other aerosol property measurements. So, for example, there's one at Cape Verde, which is run by NERC. There's the site I showed on Puerto Rico. There's one at Barbados. So those will be particularly large aerosol-based observatories, and I'm sure there's some on the coast of the US as well, which would be measuring them.
And just to clarify, that PM10 and PM2.5 are generally air quality ways describing the aerosols. So they're the aerosols all from 10 microns all the way down to the nanometer particles, whereas we've been talking specifically about the size distributions, which is an aerosol physics method of looking at the suspended aerosol in the atmosphere. PM10 and PM2.5 are specifically air quality metrics. Obviously, they are derived from aerosol data.
Yeah.
Then we've got a question from Danny. Says, is there potential for an event like this to have lasting economic and agricultural impact on the Americas?
Oh, I suspect the damage will mainly be fleeting and will not be long term from this particular event. Typically, the main economic costs of dust events are either through extra health costs, through increased hospital admission rates, or through disruption to transport services. As far as I know, I didn't come across any reports of transport being disrupted during this particular event. I haven't seen any data or had access to data on hospital admissions and medical impacts, but I would expect there to be a spike in kind of through the period respiratory complaints. That's my guess.
They of course do have there's a positive benefit because, as Claire pointed out, this mineral dust has a lot of nutrients associated with it. So the deposition of minerals like phosphorus onto the Amazon is an absolute boon for the ecosystem. So there are some positives from this. The majority of the nutrients in the Amazon has come from Africa.
Yeah, and let's not forget the potential positive impact through fewer potential hurricanes.
So, and we got a question, and we got a final question now from George, and he says, "Is the Sahara the biggest source of dust transport events in the world, or is it matched by some other world deserts?" So we've got dust transport top trumps.
Yeah, good question. So yes, the Sahara is the biggest dust source. I think in terms of emissions of dust into the atmosphere, it comes in about 60% or so of the world's dust. You'll often hear people referring to the dust belt, which sort of goes across from the west of the Sahara all the way across the Sahara through central Arabia, and then out into West Asia, kind of Kazakhstan, Aral Sea region. And then you also have the Chinese deserts, and then some dust from Australian deserts, and then a smaller amount of dust from high latitude dust sources, which can be towards the Arctic or Southern America. I think typically Chinese or Asian dust comes in at about 20 to 30% after the Sahara. So yes, the Sahara is the biggest source. Hello.
I think we might have lost Jim there now.
I'm still here for a change.
I'll turn my microphone on now. Okay, so thank you for that final question, George. Quite a nice one to finish off. So I guess it leaves it to me to thank Claire for her really interesting talk, and she covered, this event was a major talking point in the sort of the dust community on social media. It was great to watch it. So hopefully you've learned a lot about mineral dust in the atmosphere, and it can travel a very long way and have major implications. So I'd like to thank Claire again, and just to remind you that this will be posted on YouTube for you to revisit and tell your friends about it. And our next talk will be on the 26th of August, and that will be Nick Silkstone from the Met Office talking about the exceptional winter of 2019-2020. So with that, I'll bid you a fond farewell from Yorkshire.
Thanks very much, Jim, and thank you so much for inviting me.